Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Today I want to talk about geopolitics a little bit. A friend of mine asked me, or a friend of mine and I were talking about sort of the decline of Western hegemony and what this would mean in terms of the future world order. He thought that it would likely be led by India. I had to disagree. I think that we aren't going to see hegemony develop of the same sort that we've seen since the end of the Soviet Union. I think instead we'll see different countries leading in different respects, and certain areas where the US has taken a very large outsized role having to be taken by local alliances between countries. Now, I want to preface this by saying that there's, of course, this perpetual argument about the value of hegemony and the value of Western hegemony. And that argument comes down to two perspectives. The first perspective, actually I would say three perspectives. The first perspective, which is a pro-hegemonic perspective, is that hegemony provides a certain degree of public goods that the rest of the world benefits from. These include abstract ideals such as cultural goods, namely westernizing the world, but it also includes certain very clear tangibles, things like global markets, and in particular, somebody assuring that shipping isn't being attacked by pirates everywhere. This protection of shipping is actually a really big issue. Primarily because this is, a massive global endeavor, and it's largely taken on by the United States at this point. And the fact of the matter is that some of these, including protecting shipping globally, is not something that any other country is going to be able to step into the U.S.'s shoes anytime in the reasonably near future. I mean, the U.S. spends more money on military than the next 10 countries combined, right? And so that creates a big problem there, which can't be simply solved by the United States being perfectly isolationist, as much as some of us might like that. The second perspective, which is also a pro-hegemonic perspective, I'm not really going to go into it too much here, except that I've seen some people suggest it, is that the US has to be hegemon because otherwise somebody else will. We have to be the empire because otherwise China will and they'll be worse, or things like that. I don't think that that's a compelling argument because the ability of governments to resist other governments is largely dependent upon what they can enforce within their own borders. We don't live in a world where there's a single world government, and therefore the relationship between nations is anarchic. If a country like China can't enforce through military might its own hegemony, then all it has is inducements rather than an ability to actively enforce things. So I don't see Belt and Road as being the same kind of imperialism that, for example, the Iraq War or the US-led efforts of regime change in Syria were. But that's about as much as I'm going to say about that perspective. It's not really going to factor into this. It's not going to factor into this analysis in much of a way. I just wanted to mention it because I've heard it several times. The other perspective, though, which you hear oftentimes from members of the Global South, is that, hey, look, Western countries always say they're doing things in our best interest, but really a lot of these things aren't stuff that we want. We want an order where people aren't lonely in old age, where family connections matter a lot more than they do in the West, where the economy isn't as exploitative and stuff like that. And this perspective sees a lot of Western hegemony as being ultimately self-serving and being a way of draining resources from the global South towards basically former and sort of neo-colonial powers. Countries like France, Germany, Spain, but also, of course, the UK and the US. And there's a lot to this perspective too. So you have the public goods issue and then you have the imperialism issue, and those two things kind of clash. So if you want to see what is the new world order going to have to do, it's going to have to replace many of those public goods, and it's going to have to do so in a way which sort of addresses the experiences of those who are coming into charge. I also don't see any country being able to step up and kind of exert the same kind of hegemonic influence that the US has exerted. For this reason, this means we're heading into a multipolar world, and the fundamental question is who the poles are going to be as the West continues to decline in influence. I think in the midterm, we will see this decline happen to the point where the West is no longer sort of the cultural center of the world. And I think that the primary countries that will be leading this will be in no particular order, and I'll explain why ordering is problematic. India, China, Russia, probably Indonesia, maybe the UAE. But I think a lot of what the UAE offers is redundant to what Russia is starting to offer, and consequently the UAE's role is likely to be kind of more comparable to that of Singapore, being able to exist as a bridge state between relatively hostile parties. So I want to go through each of these and why I think that they'll play an important role, and what kind of roles I think they'll play. So obviously starting with China. China's has an extremely large consumer economy, second largest in the world behind the European Union. They have more consumption than the US does in terms of bulk consumption. They also have a very clearly focused and frankly weaponized economy. To the extent that China is likely to be a global power, while they are likely to have some military force, and while this is likely to be important to some extent in cooperation over protecting shipping, their primary force is likely to be inducements for trade and that sort of thing. China is likely to be the consumer capital of the world, and they are able to monetize this and capitalize on it towards other goals. And that gives them a very large amount of power. It's not hegemonic by any means. If Russia were to be destroyed and China were to buy large amounts of Russian industries, then China could be hegemonic, and probably would be. This, of course, has scared India to the point where India is trying to be closer to Russia than China is, specifically to prevent that from happening. But that brings me to India. India is a rising country. It's a country with massive consumption. It's a country which is one of sort of the technical capitals of Asia, along with China and Japan, but India's role is a little different. While many of these countries have great universities and places, the Indian Institute of Science, which my great-grandfather helped found, has helped establish India as as a technological powerhouse, comparable to many of the other, comparable to many Western countries. India today is one of the largest manufacturers of vaccines, and they started producing their own COVID vaccines separate from anything that was on the market later in the pandemic. So I see India becoming a technology powerhouse, but I also see them being something of a diplomatic wild card and a country which is also very strong militarily, but is not really in a position to act as a global hegemon. Russia. Why is Russia on my list? This was the big point of the discussion. So if I were coming up with this list a year and a half ago or a year ago, Russia would not be on my list. But a number of things have happened over the last year, all related to the war in Ukraine. The single largest thing is that the West has done their absolute best to ruin Russia through sanctions, which of course they've done to many other countries in the world. And consequently, many countries in the global South have a lot of sympathy for Russians just on the basis of what the West is trying to do to Russia. Putin has been extremely good at turning that into political capital with other countries in the global South. And I think that Western countries haven't been paying attention to how successful he's been at this. But that's not really here nor there. Russia has a problem, which is that nobody actually likes what they're doing in Ukraine, for good reason. And I don't think that they will strongly forgive Russia for that. But Russia's in a position where they are increasingly becoming a world power that is able to offer protection against the West. We're not talking so much about what happened in Syria, although that's one example, so much as we're talking about the fact that Russia has their own SWIFT alternative. And it's almost certain at this point, although Russia's being very tight-lipped about who's participating, that most of Africa seems to have joined that. Large portions of Southeast Asia, I'm convinced, are integrated in that system. And the issue is people need to buy grain, and consequently, if there's a fear that SWIFT sanctions could interfere with that, it's just much easier to get rid of that fear and integrate with Russia's system directly. So here's a good case where Russia's been able to take a clear need and leverage it to create opportunities that didn't exist there before. At this point, it's very unlikely that SWIFT sanctions will ever again be able to cut non-Western countries off from other non-Western countries. These will be able to go through Russia's system instead, and now people have a choice, which means the effectiveness of Western sanctions on the rest of the world has now been dramatically reduced. The second area is that before this war, the West had a near monopoly on maritime insurance, with the restrictions on insurance to Russian tankers. This has become suddenly not a Western monopoly anymore, because Russia simply said, okay, well, if West won't insure our tankers, then we'll have to. And so this is another example of an area where they've had to quickly address something in the domestic market, which is likely to be able to be sold externally quickly. The next thing which is worth watching is that modern avionics systems for passenger airliners are largely a Western monopoly. So you have Thales, you have Honeywell, you have a few more. Basically industrial computer providers. Now, you don't need extremely powerful chips for this. Russian chip manufacturing is able to manufacture chips to about where the West, what was cutting edge in the West in 2002. So, not great chip by modern standards, but if you consider that the Airbus A320 came out in 1988, modern fly-by-wire airplanes are quite capable of working off of such technologies. And so Russia's probably going to have to build something for their domestic market very, very quickly. And over time, if they can show a proper safety record and things like this, they may become a supplier of last resort for other countries as well. And in particular, something to watch will be if Comac ever starts making airplanes with Russian components instead of Western components. That would be a very big sign that China is interested in sanction-proofing their economy. If they start doing that, then China's in a good spot not to be messed with either. And suddenly you have an economy that would be very, very, very hard for the West to try to sanction to serious pain. So the role I see Russia playing actually is largely a protection against the West role. As the West declines, there's the question of what will happen to that. I don't really think they'll remain with a very central role, but who knows? Never know what somebody's going to be able to build with what they have until they do it. But they are well positioned to do a lot of things. They also have a strong navy, which is important when it comes to. They have a strong blue water navy. That's important. Navy that can project force very far afield. And the reason why that's important is that also gets back to the question of protecting shipping against piracy in the high seas. I see Russia taking a very important lead on that, along with Indonesia in particular, China to a lesser extent, probably India to a much lesser extent, probably not even really India much. Western Europe may still play a role in that, US may still play a role on that, but I think that those roles will be declining. So that's why I put Russia in that list. And actually, Russian energy is a completely secondary concern. On to Indonesia. Indonesia is a diplomatic powerhouse, and it has been for decades. Indonesia was the birthplace of the non-aligned movement, which was an effort at getting states to resist the Cold War. There's this line in The Year of Living Dangerously where the character Billy says, "Today Sukarno says to the West, tells the West to go to hell, and today Sukarno is the voice of the third world." And there's a lot to be said for that characterization. Indonesia is a country which has brought countries together from multiple continents in order to resist the West and Western imperialism and Soviet imperialism consistently over the decades. They have a history of this and are likely to be one of the major forces going forward in terms of bringing people together and other countries together in alignment. So I see Indonesia as exercising a massive degree of diplomatic clout, probably more than any of the others. And then on top of this, Indonesia has to have a fairly, or will have to have a fairly capable navy in order to just protect shipping in Indonesian waters, because Indonesia is a large archipelago, and consequently, shipping is much more important. Ships are exposed, it's rugged terrain, and on top of that, Indonesia doesn't have a strong police culture because Indonesia is a very decentralized state. So I see Indonesia as, by necessity, having to build a strong navy. Their navy already does things like protecting fishing and things like that. And so I see Indonesia as also playing this very strong role. As for the rest of the countries, as for the West, we'll see what role they play. But I stand by my general assessment that the major powers of the next world order will be China, India, Russia, and Indonesia. And then you'll probably have Singapore playing both sides on the China versus US, China versus West, and you'll probably have the same thing with the UAE in Russia versus the West. And those countries will probably do very well, but they probably won't exert a lot of force or transform the world order in any significant way. So those are my thoughts on this. Let me know what you think in the comments. Talk to you later.